love you and all that you do. Okay, good. I failed to let Debbie know and Doug, and so he remembered. We're on the same page as far as the title goes. We're going to finish up where we left off last week with the contrarian lifestyle. And the reason I called it that is because how you and I look at life, and especially in how we view and respond to suffering and hardship and adversity, is contrary to the way the rest of the world is. We talked about things last week such as hardship. We talked about the benefits that come from that hardship. And we looked at the life of Joseph and the perspective that God gave him and the victory that he achieved because of that perspective. Today, as we finish up, we're going to look at Joseph and his father Jacob with a particular focus centered upon Jacob. Now, just prior to Jacob's death, Joseph brought his boys to say goodbye to Grandpa and to be blessed by him. Joseph's sons were born in Egypt. They were born to an Egyptian woman. So Joseph wanted to make sure that he wanted that blessing for his sons, to make sure that his boys and their descendants would be numbered among Abraham's descendants, and that they would receive their future inheritance in the promised land. Now, of these boys, Manasseh is the older son, Ephraim is the younger. And when you were blessing your children, the right hand, which is the hand of greatest blessing and honor, that was to be placed on the head of the oldest son. But Jacob crosses everything up, and he places his right hand on Ephraim's head, the younger brother. And Joseph speaks up. He says, "Dad, you've got it wrong." And Jacob, in essence, says, "I know exactly what I am doing." It was a prophetic moment. It was a spiritual highlight in Jacob's life. In this dog-eat-dog world, the first shall be first and the last shall be last. But in God's kingdom, it's the exact opposite. And God doesn't work in this fashion because he's soft-hearted and favors the underdog. He works in this fashion because it speaks to who he is and how he works in every situation. Think about it. Jesus is born in a barn to common people. In his ministry, he reaches out and chooses the marginalized, the outcast, pagans, women, children, people who are despised like tax collectors. He gives himself to be beaten and to die. In short, salvation is brought about exactly the opposite way that the rest of the world would do it. Strength comes out of weakness as God puts his hand on the wrong son, so to speak. God operates contrary to the world's assumptions and expectations. And Jacob, in Genesis 48, he looks back at his own life and he sees this. The writer of Hebrews chapter 11 verse 15 chooses this moment of blessing his grandchildren as Jacob's premier act of faith. You see, throughout his life, Jacob has been lying. He's been grasping. He's been scheming. He's been trying to help God out so he can obtain blessing and favor and prosperity. And while he had material wealth and success, it came with suffering, loss, and bitterness, to the extent he cries out 6 chapters earlier in Genesis 42, he says, "Everything's against me." But now, in this moment of blessing his grandchildren, he defies family pressure, he goes against cultural norms, and he blesses his grandsons as God tells him to bless his grandsons. He sees and submits to God's contrarian ways of moving in our lives. in this moment of blessing his grandchildren, he looks back on his life. He remembers running from his brother Esau and fearing for 20 years that his brother would come after him and kill him. He was close to his mother. She dies when he's living in a foreign country. He thinks back of the treachery and theft that he experienced from his uncle Laban, the premature death of his wife Rachel, the loss of many years of his son Joseph. And as he looks back on this, he says to Joseph, "The God who has been my shepherd all life long to this day, the angel who has redeemed me from all evil, bless these boys." He's able to look back and see that in the midst of all that he endured, all of the hardship, all of the suffering, all of the loss, that God was working behind the scenes to bring about a good end in his life. During the last, I feel it coming on. During the last few days of Cheryl's life, Mark came to the house so we could finalize the arrangements of her memorial service. And in the course of our conversation, he said something very simple, but in that moment it was extremely profound and helpful, and it still is to this day. He looked at me across the table and he said, "Joe, God never wastes our pain. He never does." And I thought to myself, self, if that's true, then I don't want to waste it either. David wrote in Psalm 30, "O Lord my God, I cried to you for help, and you healed me. Weeping may tarry for the night, but joy comes with the morning." There is a joy, not a happiness. Happiness is based upon the circumstances in which I find myself. Joy springs from the presence of God in our lives. There is a buoyancy of soul that springs from God's presence that comes to us not in spite of suffering, it comes to us through suffering. Listen to Psalm 126, verses 5 and 6. "Those who sow in tears will reap with songs of joy. Those who go out weeping, carrying seed to sow, will return with songs of joy, carrying their sheaves with them." What David is saying is they are planting their tears and they are reaping a harvest of joy. You and I cannot move through this life without weeping. We can't. But as we move through this life and as we weep, are we sowing our tears or are we wasting our sorrow? You know, if a sower takes all of his or her seed and just dumps it on the ground, the load that they carry is lighter. But there's no harvest. There's just a pile of seed on the ground out of which nothing good grows. Venting does help. It lightens the load. But if that's all you and I do, if all we do is just vent, nothing good really comes from it because we're still left with a messy pile in front of us. Go ahead and vent so you don't burst. But then sow your tears. Sow your tears. As a sower in that day would walk out into his or her field, they would scatter that seed as they move forward through the field. In the same way, you walk forward in your life, one step at a time, one day at a time. You sow those tears in prayer. You pray through the sorrow, the pain, the heartache, the disappointment, and give it all to God. And by doing that, it doesn't necessarily change your situation, but it does change you. Because in sowing your prayers, it eliminates the weeds of anger, self-pity, and despair that would choke the life out of you. And by eliminating those weeds, it produces a harvest of joy, a buoyancy that will nourish and sustain your soul. And by sowing your tears through prayer, you come through, and you'll come through that time whole and intact. You'll come through better and not bitter. Tears, Paul reminds us in 2 Corinthians, he encourages us here. We do not want you to be uninformed, brothers and sisters, about the troubles we experienced in the province of Asia. We were under great pressure, far beyond our ability to endure, so that we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we had felt we received the sentence of death. But this happened that we might not rely upon ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. Out of weakness and vulnerability comes strength and confidence and courage and peace, because we are relying upon Him and not the limitation of our own resources. Here's that phrase I shared with you last week that has become very important to me through the years, where he says, so we do not lose heart. We do not lose heart. Though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. And as I reminded you last week, what was Paul's life like? Well, we know he was arrested multiple times. He was whipped at least 5. He was run out of town on several occasions. He had been stoned with rocks and left for dead. And how does he describe it? For this light, momentary affliction is preparing us for an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison, as we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. Our sufferings become a source of renewal. And we have the resiliency to withstand affliction, because this renewal is preparing us for the eternal glory that awaits us because of the death and resurrection of Jesus. It produces within us a joy that fleeting circumstances cannot take away. In 2 Corinthians 12, Paul speaks of some chronic, painful condition. He called it a thorn in the flesh, an affliction that drove Paul to pray 3 times, asking God to heal and deliver him. And what did God say? My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. As I said, there are some lessons I have had to learn through suffering because I'm too proud, too stubborn, too independent. There is a humility, a wisdom, a joy, and a power that can only come through suffering, because it forces us to rely upon God and His grace. Addressing fears held by some at the church of Thessalonica, they were afraid that the Lord had come back, and that they and those that they had loved who died in the faith had been left behind. And in addressing these fears, Paul says, we do not want you to be uninformed, that you may not grieve as others do who have no hope. So you and I, we sow our tears, but we won't grieve with unresolved guilt. We sow our tears, but we won't be swallowed up with self-pity or resentment. We sow our tears, but we won't grieve impatiently. We will come to the place where we trust God to do His work in His way, in His time. We will not be crushed. We will not be destroyed. We will not be embittered by our grief. Rather, as Paul writes in Romans 5, our suffering will generate patience, humility, love, wisdom, and godly character. We can have this because of the resurrection. Amen. Thank God it's not just for someday when my life here ends and I cross over to the other side. Thank God there is something real for the here and now, for my life and for yours. Let's stand.